If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you'll know that I'm a big advocate of quality over quantity, even going as far as to say you should be posting on Instagram less often. But is there a chance that posting every single day is actually the way to go? In this video, I am going to experiment with using that strategy on my own Instagram account, and we're gonna look at the results. Starting in February, I decided to make an intentional increase in my posting frequency on Instagram to see what impact it would have on my insights. If we peek here into my content scheduler, you'll see that I was posting to my feed pretty much every weekday. I missed a couple places here and there, but I was posting on average 5 times a week. In addition to the feed posts, I was definitely posting every single weekday on my Instagram stories, pretty much without an exception. To me, every weekday is pretty much as close to every single day as I'm ever gonna get because I know my audience and I know that they're not as active on the weekend. So for me to be putting a ton of effort into posts that would be going up on Saturday and Sunday when I know my followers are out doing other stuff, probably wouldn't be worth the effort. So for me, posting every day is every weekday. Now, throughout this entire experiment, of course, I am trying to implement my best content creation strategies that I always talk about on this channel, like crafting shareable content, sharing vulnerable stories with my audience, and writing super value-packed captions. That being said, let's dive into the results. I noticed 3 main things after doing this experiment, the first of which being my story views went up. If we look back on some of my stories from January and the very beginning of February, just after I started this experiment, you'll notice that I was pretty frequently getting between 400 and 500 story views. That was a bit low for me because I feel like with an audience of about 8,000 people, that is sort of a lower number than I would ideally be hitting. But what actually is a good reach rate for Instagram stories? Well, according to a study I found by Rival HQ, they looked at a ton of different Instagram profiles and found that the average reach rate for an account with less than 10,000 followers in 2019 was just about 8%. You can see on this graph here that it really varies depending on the number of followers you have, and in general, the trend is as you have more followers, the reach percentage of your Instagram stories starts to go down. It's also worth noting, in case you're feeling bad about your current reach compared to past years, that on the whole, everybody has seen their Instagram story reach decrease over 2018 to 2019, as you can see in the chart. Which is part of why I was feeling a little discouraged, to be honest, because I remembered my Instagram story views being higher when I had less followers. But don't worry, it seems to be happening to everybody, so you don't need to feel bad if your Instagram story views have gone down a little bit since last year. That being said, I still really wanted to see them go up, so when I started posting every day to my stories and to my feed pretty much every weekday, I did see an increase in story views. By the end of February, I was usually getting anywhere from 700 to 800 views on each of my stories. In case you're wondering how I compare to the average, 8.4% of my current audience as I film this video would be about roughly 700 people. So 700 story views would be fitting into the average story views that an account with 10,000 or less followers would get. So I'm super pleased to get up towards 800 followers because in my mind, the goal would be to have about 10% of my audience viewing my Instagram stories, which is definitely a pretty lofty goal, but it's something that I want to strive for. Speaking to the story strategy specifically, let's talk about what I was posting to my Instagram stories in order to see these results, because it's not just about posting as frequently as possible. You want to have some quality content there, which is something that I want to speak to throughout this video. So my typical day when it comes to posting stories comes in 3 main parts. The first time I post to my story, it's around 9 a.m. At this time, I like to do a 15 or 30-second video talking about what I'm doing for the day and asking for engagement from my audience. Usually I'll be talking about a YouTube video I'm filming or other work that I happen to be doing that day. I really try to keep these either 1 or 2 video clips long because I find once they get into the range of 3 and 4, people really drastically start to drop off at the end because it just starts to get a little bit long. I always write detailed captions for these videos, not necessarily transcribing what I'm saying in the video, but I make sure that whatever the meaning of that clip is well represented in the text because I know the majority of people are not listening to the audio. So I post that at 9 a.m. and then later on throughout the day, probably around 11 or noon, I like to post a photo of something that's kind of eye-catching that's just from my day in the life. So maybe it's a picture of a latte next to my laptop, maybe it's my desk, maybe it's my plants with, some kind of caption with that. Either way, it's sort of an on-brand aesthetic photo because I find that breaks it up a little bit rather than just seeing my face like for my entire story. On this slide, I almost always try to use some kind of sticker, whether it's a slider or a poll or a question box, so that I can really try to explicitly encourage engagement from my audience. Then later on in the day, around like 5 to 7 p.m., depending on what I'm doing that day, I'll try to post something that's a little bit more of like an active video or boomerang. So if I go to roller derby practice, maybe I'll post a clip of me skating, or maybe it'll be like a silly clip of me dancing around to a song on Instagram Music. Whatever it is, it shows a little bit of my personality, but it's also hopefully more dynamic than just a regular selfie video, so that it'll kind of stand out from the crowd, because so many videos on Instagram stories are just people filming their face, which is totally fine. I do that too, but I find that it sort of breaks through a little bit if I show a video of something more than that. To me, it's really important to be posting at these 3 separate times throughout the day, because then ideally I'm pushing myself to the front of that story feed as often as I can, rather than posting all of my content at once at the end of the day or the beginning of the day. I do always try to put whatever my most important content is in the morning, because I find the stuff posted around 9 a.m. Eastern tends to get the most views, also probably because it's the first thing in my story. So even if people are watching it at 6 p.m., they'll watch the 9 a.m. stuff first, and they might, drop out before they get to the end of the content, which is pretty typical. Definitely do not stress if people are leaving your story before it's done. That's always going to happen. In fact, you can check out this chart from the same Rival HQ study that shows a little bit about the drop-off rate when it comes to Instagram stories and what is typical. So all of that being said, one of the main things that I noticed when I started posting every day on Instagram is that my Instagram story views increased. So let's talk about the second thing I noticed. We came to the desk for this one because we're really gonna dive into the numbers, because the second thing that I noticed when I started posting every day is that my engagement rate went up. Now, I find this really interesting because back about a year ago, when I started experimenting with posting less often, and I was suggesting you guys do the same, that was actually because I noticed that my engagement rate went up when I was posting less frequently to my feed. But this past month, I definitely noticed that I had more posts with a super high engagement rate when I was posting more frequently. So let's look at the data. So I've got this spreadsheet of my Instagram engagement rates. I've calculated this all myself. If you're interested in a tutorial of how to find out this information about your own account, then let me know in the comments below, because I'd be happy to make a video about how you can calculate your own engagement rates. But just know, for the sake of this video, I figured it all out and it's tracked in this spreadsheet. Before we dive into my stats, let's talk about what a good engagement rate might actually be, because probably a lot of you are wondering this as well. According to Scrunch, a good engagement rate would be about 3%. According to their data, what they would call a less than great engagement rate is 1%. Between 1 and 3.5% is pretty average. 3.5 to 6% is what they would definitely say a good engagement rate is, and anything above 6% they would classify as very high. Those are pretty good stats in terms of an industry standard, but it is worth saying that just like Instagram story view rate, engagement rate is also going to decrease with the more followers that you have. Personally, I really like to aim for an engagement rate of 10%, but diving into this spreadsheet, you'll notice that I never actually have hit that, though my best posts have come pretty close. The other thing about engagement rate is that I don't necessarily think the traditional sense of engagement rate is necessarily the only thing that matters, because when we look at my stats, you'll notice that some of my posts that don't have a very good engagement rate compared to the others actually have a lot of saves and shares. Now, these things serve different purposes. When it comes to a traditional engagement rate, that's really a measure of how well your audience is connecting with your content, whereas the saves and shares is an indication of how viral your content has the potential to be and how much organic reach it can generate for you. So you can see my average engagement rate from February was 6.6%, which according to Scrunch is very good. So I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, I'm always working to make that higher. If we look back at January, you'll notice that my average engagement rate was 6.1%. So you're probably thinking, Katie, that's not a huge increase, like what's the big deal? And I feel that, but if we actually look at the numbers, you'll notice that my instances of a really high engagement rate were a lot more frequent in February. In January, I only had one post with an engagement rate over 8%. That was a 9.8% engagement rate, which is really good. That's close to the 10% I'm aiming for. But if we look at February, you see that we have 4, almost 5 posts that hit that 8% or greater threshold. Now, I roughly doubled the amount of times I posted if you look at January versus February. However, that's not a great representation of frequency since February is a shorter month. But just by sheer number of posts, I roughly doubled the number of posts that I made, but I more than doubled the amount of times that I got an 8% or higher engagement rate. The more you post, the more people actually are getting engaged with your content, which to me makes pretty good sense because it's likely that my followers are seeing my face on their feed more often, they're feeling more connected to my story, and so they're more likely to engage and comment. And because they comment every so often and I comment back, they're encouraged to keep engaging with me because they've seen that I will reciprocate it. If we look at the kind of posts that get a really high engagement rate, you'll see that it's often a photo of me in a sort of like lifestyle or office type setting. Another common factor among these posts is that often I've made them into an album or a carousel post where the second image is some kind of graphic that is shareable or savable or somehow really communicates a lot of information and value to my followers. And of course, all of these posts have really engaging, quite long captions. And if we take a look at an example of a post that didn't do so hot when it comes to traditional engagement rate, but got a really good number of saves and shares, you'll see it is one of these made for Instagram shareable graphics that I've been talking about so much this year. In the caption, I specifically say, if this speaks to you, share it to your story. And that definitely was effective considering we had 52 people share it, which is really, really good for me compared to the other stats that I have here. Thanks for sticking with me in that deep dive into the data, but that was only the second thing that I noticed from posting more often this past month. Let's talk about the third outcome I noticed. The third thing that happened when I started posting almost every day in February was that I got way more DMs. I think this makes sense. It's because people were seeing my content more often and they were reminded more frequently that they could reach out to me if they had any questions about Instagram, social media marketing, or my services. Now you might be thinking, DMs, what's the big deal? It's just more messages. But I really believe that DMs are one of the best ways to connect with your followers and turn those somewhat interested followers into dedicated fans. And especially if you are selling a product or service, this is the moment to turn those followers into customers. Also, the benefit to the algorithm is that if you are DMing with someone regularly, it's way more likely that they are gonna see your Instagram stories and your feed posts because Instagram has connected it that you two are friends and will wanna see each other's content. So the more of your followers that you can reach out to by DM and have conversations with, the more likely it is that person is gonna see your content and then hopefully engage with it. If you're still skeptical and you wanna hear more about how using DMs can actually grow your Instagram in a way that you would probably be surprised by, make sure you check out this video because I made an entire video diving deep into using DMs to grow your account. And honestly, I think it's gonna change your total perspective on direct messaging on Instagram. But before you head over to that video, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of my future videos. As always, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you over in this one. Okay, bye.